Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the ICNC webinar series. It's a very hot noon in Washington area. Hopefully, it's not as hot as here in wherever you are. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Advisor at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And I'm delighted to host Jacob Lewis as the guest speaker of this ICNC webinar series. Today's webinar is titled, How Does Trust Shape Civil Resistance? Initial Evidence from Africa. Jacob's talk will be based on his forthcoming ICNC monograph, How Social Trust Shapes Civil Resistance, Lessons from Africa. And we will post the link to the pre-publication copy of the monograph in the chat room of this webinar. So if you are interested in accessing the monograph PDF, please go to the chat room to check the link and download the publication. I remember meeting with Jacob in late 2018 at Maryland University for the public presentation delivered by another ICNC fellow, Jonathan Pickman. After his presentation, I had a chance to converse with Jacob about his doctoral research and his research interest in social trust in protest movements against corruption across African countries. And his conversation and thinking about integrating social trust more tightly into civil resistance practice and scholarship all sounded to me very promising. So I encouraged that time Jacob to watch out for the ICNC call for monograph proposals that we're planning to release in 2019. And once we did, we received a number of research proposals, and among them, there was a proposal from Jacob on the role of social trust in civil resistance struggles in Africa. And we thought that his initial propositions in that proposal that focus on the role and impact of social trust in civil resistance campaigns could yield a very relevant and practical findings for activists, and also pave the way for insightful research into how social trust can influence mobilization and participation in nonviolent campaigns. We are also interested in the research that would focus on nonviolent resistance in Africa, that it's still quite under-researched geographical area in civil resistance studies. I do think that Jacob's groundbreaking monograph that includes quite eye-opening findings on the role of social trust in civil resistance campaigns with the specific focus on Africa offers scholars, practitioners, and activists a lot of interesting and practical information. His findings can stimulate new research, new scholarship, and the monograph also provides activists with actionable recommendations on how to improve the odds of their success if only they start paying a greater attention to the importance of social trust in planning the nonviolent resistance. So I would like to remind our audience that we live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter at Civil Resistance, and people can share their reactions using hashtag ICNC webinars. And I would like to now briefly introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Jacob Lewis is Assistant Professor of Global Politics in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University. His research centers on conflict processes and political psychology in the African context. He holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, and he has worked extensively in the fields of international development and public policy. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask Jacob to take over from me. And Jacob, please go ahead with your presentation and with your key findings.
Wonderful. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm Jacob Lewis. I'm an assistant professor of global politics at Washington State University, as Maciej just said, and I'm very excited to talk about some of the findings from my forthcoming monograph, How Social Trust Shapes Civil Resistance, Lessons from Africa. So start my timer so I don't go over. Great. So I just want to start by introducing the context in which I'm writing this. Over the past 15 years, we've observed the reemergence of major challenges to democracy all around the world. So we're seeing democratic backsliding in established democracies, even here in the United States. And in developing democracies, we've seen halts and reversals in promising growth that people have been talking about for a while, and now we're a little bit nervous about that. I probably don't have to tell you this, but the deracination of democracy has been concomitant with rising polarization and what seems like a decrease in social trust. At the same time, we're seeing that civil resistance is becoming quite common as a form of conflict around the world, in the United States, in Hong Kong, South America, across Africa. Now, there's something kind of interesting about this, which is that trust seems like it's the kind of thing that should be central to any sort of collective action or, and especially civil resistance. But we have this decreasing social trust. So I wanted to look at this emergent question. What role does trust play in civil resistance? Okay, so I'm going to take a look at two important elements of civil resistance and try to begin to tease out what role different types of trust play in them. The first is a big one, mobilizing new participants. Whether you're a civil resistance organization or you're part of a larger campaign, you need people. You need people to come protest with you, to hold solidarity with you. When you have more people and you mobilize people, you can gain critical mass, you can build popular support, you can start to capture the narrative that then brings even more people in. It matters to bring people in. It also matters because you can put pressure on the government. A large, sustained campaign with hundreds of thousands of people across a country is massively powerful. So mobilizing new participants. I'm also interested in maintaining nonviolent discipline and how trust might shape that. Now, nonviolence is at the core of civil resistance, right? So sort of you can't have civil resistance without maintaining nonviolent discipline and employing nonviolent tactics. It's sort of part of the whole gestalt of it. So why is this important? Well, remaining nonviolent helps to maintain control over the narrative. It's easy for opponents of a civil resistance organization to smear an entire campaign as violent and scofflaws and just violent uprisers if there is violence used. Moreover, there's quite a bit of work that shows that remaining nonviolent can attract new participants, right? People, bystanders sitting on the side say, I can protest, I can do that. They don't have to overcome any sort of moral or ethical concerns over using violence. And, it's physically less demanding. So I really want to know, how does trust shape these important factors of civil resistance? So I want to introduce sort of the overall details of this study. I'm looking at civil resistance in Africa. Now, why focus on Africa? Well, there are really two reasons that I'm interested. The first is that since the mid-1990s, there's actually been appreciable democratic growth, from the introduction of multi-party democracies, right, to effectively combating corruption in a number of countries. There's been this really promising growth that's under threat right now. And a great example of this would be quite recently in Uganda, the violent oppression of pro-democracy protesters and the jailing of opposition candidates by the Museveni regime. So again, it's like, are we returning to the bad old days? So we have these gains that are under threat. Also, Africa's actually been a hotbed of civil resistance over the past decade, 12 years or so, right? And a few examples are the overthrow of the regime in Sudan, the overthrow of the regime in Algeria, and current sustained non-violent resistance to the Mnangagwa regime in Zimbabwe. Right? This is a tip of a much larger iceberg. And so I think Africa has been sort of underrepresented in the civil resistance literature, and I want to address that. Now, I take a little bit of a different tact in my research. Macha mentioned I consider myself a political psychologist. I do a lot of work looking at individuals. Now, this is different from a lot of civil resistance work that's looked at campaigns and organizations and their trajectories. But I think it's overlooked. Individuals are a really important key element of any collective action. And so what I want to argue is that understanding the micro level of civil resistance is really important for activists and scholars. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to present some of my highlights to try to impress that upon you. So again, I'm researching trust at the individual level, and I'm using nationally representative survey data from 33 countries across Africa, and I analyze them using multi-level statistical models. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about statistics in this presentation, but for those of you that are interested, the monograph has a full statistical appendix, and I'm more than happy to share my replication scripts using R with anybody that emails me, and I have my email at the end of this presentation. Okay, so I'm focusing on trust. Now, trust is a weird thing, right? It's not one thing, it's many things. It's the amount of trust I put into different groups of people that's funneled through different relationships. And so because I'm using survey data, I'm actually able to look at different types of trust. I look at generalized social trust, which is, you know, if I were to go to somebody and say, hey, can most people be trusted, or do you have to be careful? That's a very common way to talk about generalized social trust. It's not a great way to ask the question, but it gets to the larger esprit of the whole idea. I look at trust in one's co-nationals. How much do I trust other members of this country? I look at trust in neighbors. Again, sort of an interesting milieu of people to look at. Sometimes you can control who your neighbors are, but often you can't. I look at trust in acquaintances. So those people with whom I voluntarily associate, whether through work or my social interactions. And finally, trust in diverse populations. Some of you might know this as what we call outgroup trust, the idea that I'm going to, how much do I trust people who are citizens of this country but don't share my ethnic identity? Okay, so my core argument is founded on two primary assertions. The first is pretty simple. High trust should foster mobilization. Why might it do that? Well, trust might alter the perceived costs of participating in civil resistance. And to understand this, you have to understand how social scientists conceive of trust. Some think of it as a very thin, encapsulated trust, where I trust another person to do something for me. But more and more, we see the idea that trust is about building moral communities, right? I trust people because I trust their character, their moral character. And so if I think of trust that way, I could understand that a bystander who's not politically active, but who does trust the moral character of a civil resistance organizer, maybe it's somebody that they've met who's part of an organization, maybe it's the leader of that organization, they are going to think, yeah, I might go join a protest with that organization. I trust where they're going to bring me. Also, there might simply be a sense of missing out. So as we extend our moral communities beyond ourselves, we might feel like, wow, all these people are out there protesting and paying the costs of mobilizing, and they're doing something to produce maybe democratic benefits for me. I need to get out there too. It actually becomes costly psychologically to not go out there. Finally, trust might simply solve a standard collective action problem. Well, what is that problem? Nobody wants to be the only activist to show up. Nobody wants to be the single person that shows up at 8 in the morning in the town square with a placard and looks around and suddenly they're feeling vulnerable and weak and foolish. It might simply be that high trusting individuals are more likely to trust that others will also show up. So all of this yields a prediction, which is that higher social trust should correspond with an increased willingness to participate in a protest or a demonstration. Now, my second assertion is that trust increases nonviolent discipline. And I measure this using sort of an interesting approach that I'm happy to discuss later. Trust reduces the willingness to use violent tactics. Why might this be? Well, one might simply be a confidence game. If I'm out thinking about protesting and I see that sometimes protesters are subject to repression, I have to ask myself, what would I do if repression came upon me? So I could I could start throwing stones, I could remain nonviolent, or I could, get out of Dodge. And if I trust that an organization is going to honor its nonviolent commitment, I should be more likely to think I can maintain my nonviolent commitment. And the second approach is by increasing my sense of moral community, right? Extending it to people beyond myself. I actually reduce the incentives to use violent tactics, right? By extending my trust in society at large, I am less interested in imparting violence upon it. Finally, I might trust that high density networks, so these organizations that really know each other and trust each other, have the ability to identify and sanction potential defectors and provocateurs. So all of this yields a prediction that high levels of social trust should correspond with lower justifications for the use of violent action. And then later I test observed violent action. Okay, I want to jump into my findings. And I'm going to give you 4 primary findings from the monograph. The first is, does trust increase potential mobilization? The second is, does that potential mobilization correspond with actually observing more protests? Then I look at, does trust reduce justifications for the use of violence? And finally, does trust correspond with lower proportions of violent contention? Okay, potential mobilization is kind of a strange thing to measure. In the survey data that I use, the Afrobarometer, I use multiple rounds. Respondents were asked, basically, how likely would you be willing to use to go join a protest or a demonstration? And it's within this framework of the past 12 months. And I'm calling this potential mobilization. People say, no, I would never join a protest. I've never joined one and I wouldn't ever do it. They could say, no, I've never joined a protest, but hey, I'd do it if I could. Then you have the people who have protested. Yes, I've done it once or twice, or several times, or quite often. So I'm calling this potential mobilization. And now I'm able to look at the relationship between potential mobilization and I regress that on different types of social trust. So I'll start with generalized social trust. Interestingly, I find that there's no major relationship either way, right? Now, I think this might be because of the way that the variable is asked and the number of responses that are available, but still, this does not meet my expectations. Trust in co-nationals, on the other hand, does meet my expectations. The more I trust other members of my country, the more likely I am to say I would join a protest. Trust in neighbors, again, no major reaction, does not meet my expectations. And I suspect that this is because there's something kind of random about who lives near you, unless you're at the highest end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Finally, trust in acquaintances, that particular network of people you know and associate with, does positively correlate with potential mobilization. So overall, the results are mixed, but I do find that in two of the forms of trust in co-nationals and acquaintances, I do have positive relationships there. Now, potential mobilization is really interesting, but I want to know, does it actually correspond with observed protest? So what I did was I went and looked at, in each country for each year of the survey data that I have, how many nonviolent protests are there? I expect that the highest number of nonviolent protests should be in countries with the highest reported potential mobilization. So what do I find? Well, on the x-axis, I have just the quartiles of levels of potential mobilization. And on the y-axis, the actual number of observed nonviolent protests. And as we reveal these, we see indeed that the more potential mobilization you see, or that's recorded, the more actual number of nonviolent protests we observe. Now, more needs to be done into looking at this relationship, but what this does is it shows that there is a there. Okay, now what about justification of violence? Respondents were asked to agree or strongly agree with either statement A, the use of violence is never justified, or B, it's sometimes necessary to use violence in support of a just cause. I want to now look at whether trust relates to these justifications. I'll start with generalized social trust, and I find again no major relationship, kind of strange. But when I look at all the other types of trust, whether it's in your outgroup, your diverse population, your neighbors, or your acquaintances, the more that I trust others, the more likely I am to say that violence is never justified. Okay, again, I want to see, does this correspond with something in, let's say, the real world? Although you could argue that survey data is also the real world. But what I did was, again, I looked at each country in each year, and I took the total amount of contention, that's violent riots and non-violent protests, and I put them together in an index for each country in each year. And I look at the proportion of non-violent to violent contention that we see. I then calculated an index of trust, and I just split it in half. So there are countries that are above the mean, the high trusting countries, and the countries below the mean, the low trusting countries. Well, what do I find? I find that in the high trusting countries above the mean, 91.6% of overall contention is non-violent and 8.4% is violent. And when we move to the low trusting countries, 88.4% is non-violent, and there's an increase of violent to 11.6%. Now, these are relatively modest gains, and so I want to take a look here and really dig deep. So again, here we've got we've zoomed in, and you can see our relative levels. Between these two is a 3.4 percentage point change, and what that corresponds to is a 38% increase in the amount of violent contention. Now, again, this is a relatively small amount overall, but that's because violent contention was relatively small to begin with. I don't want to overstate these findings, but I think they're really interesting and important. Okay, so what can we take away from this research? Well, I'm going to start by giving some takeaways for activists. The first is, for activists, focus on recruiting from high trust networks. Think about finding unmobilized individuals that are part of labor unions, professional organizations, and religious organizations. These organizations have played big roles in civil resistance in the African context. And that extends to the anti-apartheid civil resistance campaigns, in which we saw labor unions taking a big stand, all the way up to the Sudanese civil resistance campaign, in which we saw the Professional Lawyers Organization of Sudan really helping to cohere and sustain the protests, and then bringing in student organizations. So if you're able to bring in individuals that are already high trust, you should be able to maintain nonviolence a little bit better, hopefully. Secondly, actively foster cultures of trust. What do I mean by that? I mean that organizations and campaigns should take direct action within their respective levels of analysis. So within the organization, engage in trust building exercises. Have people get to know one another better. This could involve everything from simple conversations oriented around targeted discussions to practicing how to remain nonviolent in the face of repression. Okay. Also, it's important to clearly communicate norms of nonviolence for new participants or newly mobilized individuals that are still trying to figure out, hey, what is this organization I've joined? It's important for them to understand clearly what kind of values this organization holds. Within the campaign setting, it's important for organizations to interact with each other. They may be different organizations with different user bases and maybe even different overall goals. But if they interact with each other, they'll better be able to understand and predict what the others will do. That will help mobilization and hopefully promote nonviolent discipline. Finally, focus on developing broad and diverse coalitions. One of my findings is that the more you trust people of your outgroup, the less likely you are to tolerate or justify violent action. And so again, look to existing organizations that are multi-ethnic, multi-religious. So labor unions are again a great example of this, right? They can help develop these universal claims of getting rid of corruption or bringing more democratic reform that can not only reduce concerns about violence, but also ensure that other people feel welcome, right? This is not just an ethnic campaign, but this is sort of a campaign for all of us. Okay, what about scholars? Well, I say there are findings for scholars. What I really mean is I have two aspirations for scholars. The first is that more research needs to be done on the individual to group nexus, right? I think this is one of the most interesting areas of focus in civil resistance and frankly, conflict politics more generally. How do individuals and groups interact with each other, right? So when an individual joins a group, are they changed by the group or do they change the group? Probably a little bit of both, but it would be interesting to understand the causal relationships there. In fact, that is what I initially had proposed to study, although sadly, COVID got in the way of my field research. I think this is really critical because it will help us better understand, moving to the second part, the micro level dynamics of civil resistance, right? Individuals are the atoms of any form of politics, whether it's civil resistance or just general democracy, and understanding the micro level elements really matter. So understanding how a non-mobilized bystander perceives of a civil resistance organization or campaign matters for that campaign. It matters for their trajectories. And so better understanding how individuals engage or disengage is going to be critical for the coming challenges that we are all going to face. Thank you all so much for listening to my research. And I'm really open to engaging with you by email. My email is right up here. It's also available on the Washington State University website. And with that, I don't know how to go back, but Bruce, you can take the screen back.
Good, great, Jacob. It was excellent. It was to the point, very clear about your findings, and I think provides quite a lot of interesting food for thought and information to kind of go through and see how this could be applied to, nonviolent organizing. So first of all, I want to remind people how they can ask the questions. So they can either type the questions directly into the chat box, and I will then read those questions, and Jacob, you would then respond. Or they can raise their hand, and by raising their hand, they indicate that they would like to ask the question live, and I will unmute you, and then I will ask you to introduce yourself, say a word about your affiliation, if any, and then ask your question to Jacob live. So please take a moment and consider either raising your hand or typing the question into the chat box. And meanwhile, Jacob, I want to start from the question about exactly the role of social trust in two elements that you focus on, which is mobilization and nonviolent discipline. And I would say, well, we know that there are so many other movement-centric factors that might play a role a very important role in mobilization and nonviolent discipline. Just to start with kind of creative resistance actions that would, take into consideration of the level of risk and try to minimize the level of risk for the people when they mobilize, could play an important role in mobilization itself. Let's say instead of starting a major protest, how about we start from boycotting a certain product? That is decreasing the risk of repression possibly, and in that way helping the mobilization. So this is one example of a factor that plays a role in mobilization outside of social trust. Similar nonviolent discipline could be by promulgating certain code of conducts that emphasize, the nonviolent discipline rather than focusing on social trust might play a role. So basically, there are so many other movement-centric elements that could easily account for what you are trying to account for, and not necessarily social trust. So how do you, how do you make an argument that social trust is key, if not more important than other elements that are movement? Again, I'm talking about elements that are movement-centric, that are about strategic kind of planning and organizing. Yeah. And yeah. Then another question that you can, you can kind of think about and see if you would like to address is that social trust, as we know, plays also a very important role in violent groups. You find social trust being important in nonviolent resistance groups. So what do you think? What might be the difference in the type of social trust that is needed to keep nonviolent groups mobilized vis-a-vis violent groups that are also that some researchers would point to the fact that social trust is playing a very important role in violent groups. So what you are uncovering differently about social trust that is maybe so propitious, good for nonviolent mobilization rather than violent mobilization. So you can go ahead and respond to the questions first, and then we'll go to the audience and ask for their questions.
Thank you for those questions. Well, I'll start by saying I'm a little bit of they say a man with a hammer thinks every problem is a nail. And I probably am a little bit like that, because I think trust is maybe the most important thing in politics. Whether it's just upholding a democracy or acting collectively, it's hard to imagine that working in a sustained manner over time without trust. So you asked two really interesting questions. The first is, what role does social trust play in civil resistance actions other than protests and demonstrations? The second being, well, isn't social trust important for violent actors? I'll start with the first. I think I would argue that all collective action at its core, whether it's a boycott, whether it's not paying your taxes, right, whether it's being shut in or doing any sort of sit-in campaign, these are all collective in a sense, right? So if I don't pay my taxes, I risk harm from the government. I have to trust that others are also upholding something very private, right? I don't audit other people's taxes. So if we're doing a tax withholding campaign, I have to trust that others are doing that as well. So my assumption, I haven't tested this directly, but my assumption is that trust is going to build that movement in much the same way that trust corresponds with protests, which is that the less I trust that others are actually going to do this, the less incentive there is for me to do it anyway, whether it's a protest or whether it's withholding taxes or whether it's a boycott, right? So, especially with those things that are sort of private and non-observable. I think that's how I would take a stab at your first question. Again, as trust diminishes, it becomes harder to imagine myself taking on the potential risks associated with any sort of collective action. In fact, listen, rationalist approaches to collective action are deeply cynical about trust, right? They essentially don't think that trust can extend beyond individual interactions. I don't think that's true, right? I think oftentimes people trust more generally, more broadly, right? And that's what makes societies possible. So what about social trust in violent organizations? I mean, it's certainly true that in covert organizations like terrorist organizations, there has to be trust within that organization about non-defection, right? You know, making sure that everybody upholds certain norms of privacy, etc. Again, I wouldn't argue. I would never argue that trust only generates good stuff, right? I would suspect, but this is again a suspicion rather than any evidentiary-based statement. I would suspect that different types of trust are at play. My suspicion is that individuals that generally trust society at large are less likely to use violence against that society. And so trust within a violent group, given the specific covert nature of it, probably extends very specifically, like it's a very particularized trust. Maybe this is where you see that sort of encapsulated trust, where I trust only individuals within that violent group to uphold, you know, standards of privacy, and any violation of that immediately leads to their exile. That's a very different type of trust than the moral trust that I'm primarily working with in this monograph. Now, again, that's been the sort of, I'm just speculating, but you know, like any good academic, I'm now going to call for more research on that, which is the academic way of saying I don't know.
Great. No, it's. I think your take on my questions was great, Jacob. So thank you for that. Now I have a question from our colleague Amber French, who is asking whether you struggle with fear among survey takers. Some people are suspicious of secret government involvement in official surveys. Can we rely on your survey data? And then maybe you could, you know, briefly elaborate on the Afro barometer survey. And I don't know if you can even compare this type of survey in Africa with some other surveys on other continents in the context of that question about, you know, whether some results might have been skewed in one way or the other because of the fear of responding truthfully to the questions.
Super great question. So my own, so there's I want to address this pie with a few different slices if I can. The first is that there's always something called social desirability bias when we think about people who answer surveys, right? This is all around the world. People report voting in numbers that are just impossible. People report engaging in protests that are positively viewed and disavow engaging in protests that are now negatively viewed. People tend to give answers that they think are like not going to get them in trouble. And this is particularly the case in emerging democracies where governments don't always adhere to norms of free speech and general civil liberties. So this is something I take into account in my monograph. The Afrobarometer data include a question at the end of the survey. You know, so they spent an hour with you and they say, okay, Matcha, tell us all your views on this and that, and how likely are you to mobilize, and what do you think about violence? Right. In fact, you know, the reason that most people say they don't protest and most people say they think violence is bad, I was really suspicious that this is because they secretly thought they were talking to a government agent. Fortunately, the Afrobarometer include a question that addresses this. At the end, they say, okay, at the beginning of this, we told you that we were sent by Michigan State University, et cetera. Who sent us? And a surprisingly large number of people say you're sent by the government. So I then went and ran a set of robustness tests where I basically took all of my findings and I tested them again to see whether that was skewed by people thinking they were actually talking to a secret government agent, and it did not have any effect. So it's a really important question, Amber. I do account for that, and thankfully I don't find that there is much evidence that that would suppress the idea of potential mobilization or inflate sense of not justifying violence. Although you could make the argument that that in and of itself would be a really interesting question to look at how citizens report potential mobilization one way or another. But I'm fortunate in that it doesn't seem at least to have affected my results.
Thank you, Jacob. It was excellent response as well. I have a comment, more than a question, but maybe you'll be also able to address that from Mary Dalsin. She is referring to a course run by USIP, and where people were exploring basically interactions between secular organizations and their engagement with religious organizations. And I think what was brought up during that course was that people should recruit from high trust networks, but there was an emphasis that one needs to be cautious not to instrumentalize those networks, and actually to engage or to have a real engagement partnerships rather than focusing on recruiting from high trust networks that might be instrumentalized. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether you could maybe try to even first distinguish, and whether you are doing that in your work, between kind of, I guess what is pointed here, more kind of institutionalized networks. I mean, you refer to trade unions, which are very much institutionalized, mm-hmm. vis-a-vis kind of real engagement partnerships. I'm not sure what exactly Mary has in mind here, but let's assume kind of, grassroots, very loose type of networks that are not as institutionalized like trade unions, for example, that they might be, in fact, providing more power to the movements if one engages on that on that level of partnership, and try to establish or rely on the existing networks in those informal partnerships vis-a-vis more kind of institutionalized networks.
Right. That's an excellent question. I'm going to fumble toward an answer, but I don't know, since I'm not familiar with the source material. I'm going to sort of just extemporaneously say what I think about that. My suggestion on mobilizing from high trust networks was really built around the idea that, for a number of reasons specific to Africa, although I assume they extend beyond Africa, but I don't know, trade unions, professional organizations, and religious organizations were able to weather the storm of pretty repressive autocratic regimes in a way that loose coalitions were not. So historically, in South Africa, for example, trade unions were one of the only forms of collective action available to Black South Africans without experiencing serious government repression, in part because they were deeply integrated into the state, right? The state relied on them. And in fact, there's a bit of research that shows that integrations between these sort of organizations and the state shapes shapes whether groups use violence or not. So I certainly agree that one would need to be careful in instrumentalizing organizations in a way that abstracts from the grassroots or popular aspects of any sort of campaign. Although I would counter that in recent civil resistance campaigns, whether they're in the Zimbabwe anti-Mnangagwa campaign that I mentioned, where you see professional organizations of lawyers coming out and really putting their foot down. The same in Sudan, Algeria, Tunisia, where you have these professionalized organizations. They are able to do something important, I think, because they have built-in socialized sort of technologies right? And by technology, I mean they're able to use hierarchy to communicate norms and to communicate orders. Orders is maybe not the right word, or intentions. There is a way for people to understand this is what we're going to do. And so work by Levy and Alquist talks a bit about that, right? They have this book, In the Interest of Others. But of course, I would never say that you want to, I guess, overshadow the loose networks. I just don't know enough about how they operate in the more autocratic regimes. So I feel like that was not the best answer, but I don't have a better answer for it.
No, it was good. It was very good, Jacob, and thank you for that. And there was no specific question basically, so that might be also made response more difficult. But I think you did a great job. And I know that my colleague Bruce would also like to chime in and ask questions. So Bruce, please go ahead and ask your question.
Jacob, thank you for your presentation. This is just a fascinating study. I appreciate the focus on Africa and how it's looking at a lot of cases that tend to be overlooked. And then the angle of trust is really fascinating. My question is pertaining to your first line of inquiry around mobilization. Now, you look at 4 different types of trust, and when you showed us the findings, we see that 2 of them, there weren't really any positive results, and then 2 of them, there really was something. And so the 2 that was something was co-nationals and acquaintances, and then the 2 that it looked like they weren't something was generalized trust, and the other one was neighbors. And so I would imagine on a cursory review of those findings, one might think, all right, everything's sort of mixed, nothing's really standing out, it's contradictory, there's nothing here. I was wondering if you could unpack more why the findings with co-nationals and acquaintances carry enough weight to say there really is something here, despite the lack of positive findings for generalized trust and neighbors.
That's a great question. Thank you. Okay. So I have a deep frustration with the way that generalized trust is often asked on different barometer surveys, right? It's not just the Afrobarometer. What happens is, some time ago, somebody said generalized trust is basically, do you think most people can be trusted, or do you have to be careful? Well, those are pretty extreme answers that cover up a lot of gray. And so inevitably, across Africa, most people say you have to be careful. Now, you can simultaneously think you have to be careful and that most people can be trusted. So these are not mutually amnestic in a way that we would hope survey responses would be. I included it in the survey because I didn't want to obscure or sort of cherry pick my findings. So why is generalized trust basically shows no findings? I think it's actually a function of the way the question is asked. And I addressed that in the monograph. Neighbors are interesting. I promise I'm going to get to the co-nationals and acquaintances, but I first want to address neighbors are interesting because we generally don't pick our neighbors, right? In fact, you have to have a relatively high level of socioeconomic mobility to select who your neighbors are. And there's a whole body of research in political psychology that shows that high levels of ethnic diversity in terms of neighborhoods is either reduces or correlates with lower levels of social trust. So work by Kim Manamar Sondersko and Peter Dinesen really speaks to this. So neighbors are something that's sort of forced on us in a lot of ways, right? Those are quite different to the highly specific and voluntary aspects of co-national trust, right? How much do I trust a specific group of people in my country? I know who those people are, right? And acquaintances, right? Even deeper, people that I really know. I know them through work. I socialize with them, people that are sort of selected into my network. And so what I would argue is that the closer we get to a specific and personalized understanding of trust that probably speaks to the density of one's social networks and trust networks, the more likely we are to see a willingness to mobilize. Right? People that are high trusting and have deep networks are more likely to mobilize. That in and of itself is like not massively surprising. One of the ways I address this, though, is that I include in my statistical analysis a variable that looks at whether they are members of a civic organization, because if they, I would think that might do a lot of the work. I still find that trust matters, right? Even holding that constant. And so my suspicion is that as we become more clear about what trust is, we're better able to measure its effects on potential mobilization. And so these are the two clearest understandings of trust within the survey data. And unsurprisingly, to me at least, they correlate with higher levels, higher willingness to potentially mobilize. Again, I included generalized trust because I didn't want it to look like I was cherry picking. And so I just wanted to test everything that I could.
That's helpful. That makes a lot of sense. So would you, as a follow-up, would it be fair to the numbers to say then that a lack of trust in one's neighbors doesn't seem to be consequential toward whether someone is willing to mobilize or not?
Yeah, I mean
the implications of that for maybe a highly oppressive societies, strong authoritarian nations, and how movements can still happen.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I should have mentioned that in my previous answer. I find no statistical relationship with generalized trust or not trust in neighbors on mobilization. What that means is it doesn't seem to go either way. So I do find a strong and statistically significant relationship between co-national and acquaintance trust that indicates that there is some relationship holding all the other variables that I hold constant. There is some relationship there. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between generalized and neighbor trust. So lower levels of those trusts doesn't indicate lower levels of mobilization. It simply indicates that there's not much of a relationship. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that does. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. And we have, in fact, I don't see any other questions, so we have exhausted that. But I think the ones that we heard were very good in terms of allowing you to expand on a number of issues that are in your monograph and are important. And before I ask you to kind of give your concluding thought that you want us to leave with, I just want to remind people that we have recorded this webinar, and we will be sending the link to that recorded webinar to you very soon. If not today, then tomorrow. And there is still one more webinar that we will be inviting you before the summer ends, which would be on climate change and resistance against climate change, and delivered by our colleagues from Australia, and focusing on the campaigns in Australia, but that would have relevant findings for other climate-driven resistance campaigns around the world. So this will be on July 21st. This will be our last webinar for this kind of season before we close down for the summer. And hopefully we'll have a number of other webinars coming in fall that are yet to be set. So Jacob, I would like to ask you, to give us your final kind of thought and what you want us to leave with from your webinar.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to simply restate what I've said, but I do want to re-emphasize the importance of trust. I think trust is it's coming back into vogue because we're losing it. We're losing it in America, we're losing it across the world. And so my research is on African contention, but trust is something that matters across the board. So my concluding thoughts, what I hope you would take away from this is the understanding that without trust, it becomes very, very difficult to oppose autocratic creep, to oppose democratic backsliding. And so what we need to do, whether we're in the United States, in Europe, or in any of the African countries, is to work on trust building at the community level, right? And to be generous with one another, to give each other the benefit of the doubt. I think that's increasingly difficult to do as we get polarized. That's what I would have you all take away.
Excellent, great. Thank you again, Jacob. I would like to thank everyone who joined our webinar series. You've got here the links where you can access more information about civil resistance, about our organization and what we do. And we look forward to seeing you in the forthcoming webinar. And please stay in touch with us. Be well and stay safe. Thank you, Jacob, again, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.